Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 3. I'm going to be the guy who kept you from dinner yesterday and kept you from going home today, so I apologize immensely for that. But my name is Christopher Brown, the host of the online show Municipal Affairs. Today I have the honor to be speaking with one of my good friends, the Obi-Wan Kenobi to my Luke Skywalker. I'm not sure if that's a good reference or not, but he is my Obi-Wan. He's the one who helped me navigate the world of municipal affairs at the early days of the show. Him and I host a podcast called The Political Trenches Local Government at Work, where we sit down and we talk to municipal leaders and talk about the issues that are going on in your councils. And he is the co-author of 2 great books, Who's Driving the Grader and The DNA of Great Leaders, which you should pick up. But he is here today, and I'm going to be speaking to him later on about his newest book, something that has touched every single person in this room probably, and probably has touched every single one of your councils and communities. Civility in today's modern society around council. Ian is an expert. He has been writing this book for about 2 years since I started to know him, and he has just recently released this book by Municipal World. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my good friend, my confidant, my co-host with the most, Mr. Ian McCormack.
I tend to wander, so I've asked for a handheld mic rather than being stuck to a podium. So, Chris, that was one of the nicest introductions I have ever had. Thank you. And it's nice to be here. I have never been to St. John before, so this is really cool. I'm really looking forward to having a look around the city. And we're wandering. Craig and I are going to wander around the Atlantic provinces, or at least Nova Scotia and New Brunswick for the next week or so. So I'm looking forward to doing that as well. So as Chris said, yes, my name's Ian McCormack. I run a company called Strategic Steps. I'll just take this off. And for the sake of today, what I wanted to talk about is addressing incivility in the municipal sector. I did this same session a couple of days ago in Canmore, Alberta, for the Local Government Administrators Association there. So I warmed up on them. So you guys are supposed to get the polished version now. And as mentioned, it's nice to see some of you here again. So let's see how the clicker works. Okay. It's not working already. Good thing nobody's recording it. So Chris made a reference to some of the other books that I've written. The first one was called Who's Driving the Grader and Other Governance Questions. That one is about role clarity. And it was interesting because I'd never written a book before and never really planned on writing a book. But I was hired by the Nunavut Association of Municipalities to go to Rankin Inlet, just on the northwest coast of Hudson Bay, to spend a day with all the newly elected mayors in Nunavut talking about governance. And that went really, really well until about halfway through the day when the blizzard hit. And we realized quite soon that we weren't getting out. So the joke is now we overnighted in Rankin Inlet for 5 days. And the problem had been that I checked out of my hotel, gone to the airport, the airplane flew right overhead and never even stopped. And I was worried, and so I phoned the hotel and they said, well, you can have your room back because if nobody's coming in, you can have it as long as you need be because nobody's leaving either. So at that point, the wind is blowing, all the internet is a little bit shaky because the satellite dishes are a little bit shaky. And my assistant at the time emailed me when it was working with a list of what she called Ianisms, or things that I often say when I'm speaking at conferences. And she said, here's your table of contents, get started. And so I started writing, because I had 5 days that I didn't know that I had. And I posted on Twitter at the end of that all, I said, hey, I've written 12,000 words here. I don't know if this is just a catharsis, or if somebody actually wants to read this. So Twitter at the time was a useful tool. Municipal World, who probably most of you are aware of, tweeted back and said, if you can get this to book length, we'll publish it. Which I thought, that's pretty fantastic, because that's the biggest problem authors often have. So anyway, I did get it to book length. They did publish it, but the story is getting stuck in Nunavut had a really good outcome for me. I really enjoyed it. My mom, when I was testing titles for this book, Who's Driving the Grader, for some of you may have read it, but is there anybody in the room who doesn't understand what that term would be about? Probably. You don't understand? Okay. So it's a difference between governance and service delivery. So governors shouldn't shouldn't be driving the grader in the literal sense. They should be the ones who are setting policy for the grader driver to follow. But some of you may have experience with members of council, your colleagues, who are sometimes wanting to drive the grader. It's way more fun than setting policy in a lot of times. I want to know what every one of those little chuckles is about, but we don't have time. Anyway, so that's... Pardon? What's that?
Philip Brown probably saying something funny over there.
Chris Brown, Philip Brown? We're not going to let Philip Brown start, because if he starts, we're here for a while. And so anyway, that's that. The second book about the DNA of great leaders is about the attributes of the best functioning mayors, wardens, reeves, board chairs, that sort of thing. The best governors. And so that one came out, I think, in 2022. And I got a really nice actually, the first book, the foreword to the first book was written by George Cuff, who many of you probably know. The foreword to the second book came from Don Iveson, who was the mayor of Edmonton at the time and has since retired. The third book doesn't actually have a foreword, and it's called Uncivil Society. And this came out, well, I'll get into the story a little bit later, actually, tell you about where it came from. Some of you are likely familiar with who we are as a company as Strategic Steps. For those of you who aren't, we are a pure governance company. We do a lot of local government work right across the country. As I mentioned 2 days ago, I was working in the Rockies, and today I'm out here, and that's pretty fantastic. We work in the north, of course. We tend to follow election cycles. So when we do a lot of candidate workshops, we do a lot of council orientations, we do a lot of strategic planning, we'll do some annual priority setting, governance refreshers for those people. Because when new elected officials come into office, of course, you are fed from that metaphorical fire hose. And we acknowledge that that's the case, but think it's a really good idea to do a refresher from time to time. We'll do reviews of your governance, we'll do reviews of your organization, all of those sorts of things. When things don't go as well as they ought to, we sometimes get involved with code of conduct reviews. We're actually just wrapping up at the moment a project for the government of Alberta where we are doing a review of governance in the city of Medicine Hat, which is about 75,000 people. So those are the sorts of things we do. We have an office just outside Edmonton. Craig looks after our operation in St. John's, and so we can deal with the breadth of the company. So that's us. But when it comes to uncivil society, the idea behind this is how do we counter the scourge that is presenting itself in terms of the interactions, the mal-interactions, if you like, between individuals or between groups and our municipalities. Because that then sets up something that we call the matrix of abuse, which I'll talk about in a moment. But this is a topic that we just kept encountering and encountering and encountering, and it seemed like it wasn't something that I wanted to write about necessarily or enjoyed writing about, but it's something that became quite necessary because we saw what the importance was. We saw this as an historical problem, but it's a problem that keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And it's not just us. It's not just the municipal sector. It seems to be anybody who's involved in public service, like small p public. Whether that is any order of government, whether that's community groups, whether that's social services organizations, all of those sorts of groups seem to be being affected by a growing incivility. And we use words like harassment and abuse and all of those sort of things to deal with this. And because we've encountered it so much through so many different clients, we felt a bit of a responsibility to share what we've learned. So about 2 or 3 years ago, we put on a seminar or a symposium called Bucking the Trend. And that was to identify what the problem was. And so we came out of that with kind of 3 steps we wanted to think about. And the book kind of follows that. The first step is to really identify what the problem is. Because so much of the terminology is subjective, but some of it does require definition because of it. So we can at least talk face to face or using the same words, meaning the same things. The second part we dealt with is, why is it getting worse? I think we'll all admit that it is getting worse, but what's caused that? And then the third part is a bit about hope, and that's what can we do about it? And what can we do about it kind of breaks into two different pieces as well. What can we do about it in the long term? Because we're looking for a change in the culture that no longer says that this incivility is acceptable somehow. The tipping point seemed to be COVID, There are some stories around COVID as well. So that's the long-term culture change we're looking for, but we're also acknowledging that there are some things that we can do over the short term as well. Some practical considerations, some legislative considerations, some communications-based considerations that we can put in place that may address this. And this, of course, is these type of words that we came up with. We put out a survey of an organization we were working with a little while ago, and we said to them, what does abuse mean to you? Or what does incivility mean to you? And this word cloud reflects, and I think Craig and Tyler were the ones who actually did this. This actually reflects what we were finding, what we were talking about. So on here, some of these are subjective, but some of them are quite objective as well. When it comes to contraventions of statute, the criminal code, for example, stalking and whatnot, those have a legal definition to them. But when it comes to terms like bullying, those are much more subjective. What's bullying to me may not be considered bullying to you. It might just be, got to have a thick skin. And we'd like to talk about that a little bit later as well. But some of the things that we see are, does anybody here know what doxing is? Have you ever heard that before? Other than Tyler? Pam, what is it?
It's when somebody finds something malicious about you or something about you that can be used in a malicious manner.
Right. It's often farmed online, right, or found online. If I know your home address or where you work, your kids' names, or where they go to school, I can threaten you with that or use it against you in some fashion. So that's something that I hadn't really heard of before I started working on this book. And then there's abuse is a pretty broad statement. But within that, then, we've got demographic abuse, we've got economic abuse, we've got physical abuse, we've got mental abuse, and probably a few others as well. So those all kind of fall within that realm of abuse. I didn't even think about the financial abuse part. A lot of this is happening online. Some of it is happening in person. And I'm almost sure that every one of you who's an elected official in the room, and maybe those of you who are appointed officials as well, have experienced something like this at some point. Some more severe than others. As part of the book, I interviewed about 25 people. I tried to do equal men and women. I tried to do equal administrators and elected. What I found, and this is purely subjective on my part, what I found was that the people I spoke with, men and women, seemed to be getting the same amount of abuse, but women seemed to be getting much more severe abuse or harassment, incivility. So, for whatever reason. When it came to administrators versus elected were getting more than administrators were, which probably won't surprise anybody because you're the face of the community. So these are the sorts of things that we are dealing with and that we have tried to define. And that's set up, and I made a reference to this briefly earlier about what I call the matrix of abuse. I should say, too, that all of those different types of abuse that I were on that last slide are defined in the book. This matrix of abuse is something that is probably self-evidently obvious as soon as I talk about it. You've all seen it, you've all experienced it. The first one I wanted to deal with was abuse within council. When one or two members of council, maybe more, are abusing other members of council or harassing other members of council. And I was talking to somebody just this morning, I won't out anybody, saying that even one person on a council who is acting as who's acting in civil, I got other words, who is acting in civil will degrade the ability of that council to carry out its business and can shred the reputation of a community and can just make those council meetings something that nobody really wants to attend. It also gives permission then for the public to act that way as well in the interactions with council. So council abuse can sometimes be covered off with things like codes of ethic, codes of conduct, the covenants that you may have with each other, written documentation that I'm going to talk to in a little bit. Then we've also got members of council and abuse back and forth with mayors or wardens, that somebody's picking on the chief elected official. It's very similar to that council to council part of the matrix, but because it's to the head of council, it can have slightly different implications. Mayors and wardens can also harass or intimidate or be uncivil to other members of council too. So it can go both ways. Things like like restricting appointments to committees, particularly if they are committees that come with some form of remuneration, or restricting the ability to speak out in public, or some online harassment, where we're talking about people who obviously don't have common sense, other people. And by the way, my working definition of common sense is just people who agree with me, whoever that happens to be. Chris, do you have common sense?
I don't agree with you.
Oh, okay. Yes. Chris and I have this relationship based on mutual antagonism. It's very open and healthy. There's nothing hidden. He's often accusing me of one thing or another, and sometimes he's right. Anyway, so we have that type of abuse. Then we have abuse from of chief elected officials to staff, in particularly to the chief administrative officer, who is he is responsible to council as a whole, but it's really difficult for that CAO not to respond to what the mayor or the warden wants. And so that can be taken in a negative format as well. And then we have council abusing staff and staff abusing members of council. And you've maybe encountered this as well. And of course, council's only staff person is the chief administrative officer. But that doesn't stop members of council from going to sit down in somebody's office and doing something inappropriate. Another quick story for this. We were doing an investigation into a county, and we had found that there was a member of council who would walk into the public works foreman's office, sit down, rifle through the work orders for the day, and say, you should probably do this one. Right? Some of you, which is, and at this point, of course, the public works guy didn't know who the boss was. Is the boss this councillor who's sitting in my office telling me what to do? Or is the boss the CAO? Or maybe the general manager above him and then the CAO? So it really puts that staff member in a tough spot. So this is a case of incivility between members of staff and members of members of council. Perhaps the biggest issue we face is abuse that has something to do with the public. And the public is quite happy to reach out and touch everybody. Hallelujah, amen, all that stuff. So in this case, we see abuse towards the public, public abuse towards members of council. There's a story in the book about a rural councillor who would be confronted in the grocery store. Somebody ran his or her grocery cart into that person as a means of intimidation, saying, why aren't you doing what I think you ought to be doing? Why don't you have common sense? All of those sorts of things. We run into lots of different groups that I call the coffee shop senate. It's that group of people who meet group of old white guys, typically, who meet at the A&W or the coffee shop on Tuesday afternoons or Tuesday mornings, and they wonder why their municipality doesn't have common sense. And they're quite happy to share that information with you. And some of it's fine, objective, and some of it is purely subjective. We see the same thing with the public reaching out to the chief elected officials with threats of intimidation or de-election next time, a term we call democratic retirement, if somebody's going to happen. And then a lot of times we see negative interactions between the public and members of staff. And those poor members of staff really have no power and no authority to do anything about it. I mentioned COVID a little while ago, and this is one of the places where actually COVID helped. Because some of the places we see this incivility happening is interactions between the angry public when they come into the town office or when they come into the arena or the pool, and they want to confront a member of staff on the other side of the desk or the other side of the counter. During COVID, a lot of places put up those plexiglass barriers between the public and the staff. And the reason behind that was to prevent infectious disease transmittal. But even when COVID went away, a lot of places kept those because they made staff feel safer. So it was a positive, unintended consequence of COVID. I think it's still a negative consequence overall, but that's why it had happened. So if we look at this is this matrix of abuse, and there's more complexity to this, of course, but we don't have time to go through a ton of it. So we think about why things are getting worse now. And this is one of them. This is some of the reasons about where we started and why we're getting worse. Us versus them. The first piece here, this is again where we've seen things like transportation get easier and easier. Communication get faster and faster. So groups where we used to have a community used to be based on geographical proximity. It used to be me and my neighbors and the people down the street, and we gathered for block parties and that sort of thing. But now communities are a lot of times communities of interest. And they don't even have to live in the same literal community. It could be the curling club. It could be the Canada Games Council. It could be the church group or the school group, which then starts to distill people down into smaller and smaller, tighter and tighter groups of us. And the nature of us means that there's us and then there's everybody else, and that's them. So as the us, that coffee shop senate, say, gets together and they start to agree with one another and their comments start to get tighter and tighter and tighter, it becomes easier then to describe other people as not doing what they ought to be doing because they're not doing what we think they should be doing. So this is a big old Venn diagram with you as municipalities at the center and a whole bunch of thems and us's around. Next is the takeover from within. We're seeing this a lot in Western Canada at the moment, where right-wing groups are starting to put up candidates for office, where they're putting candidates up for school boards, they're putting candidates up for municipal councils, they're putting candidates up for library boards. And the idea behind this then is to get inside these organizations and change them to whatever they want from within. You might have something similar here, but I know it's really becoming a big problem out west. Party politics. Most municipalities, most provinces don't have parties within municipal government. Some do. And I think that that's caused a bit of a problem too, because now the caucus is beholden to the party rather than the people that elected them. I have a friend, a colleague, who is the Integrity Commissioner for the City of Vancouver, which does have parties. And I was talking to her the other day. She and I were both at this conference in Canmore a couple of days ago. And she texted me early in the week, and she said, I'll be in Canmore if I don't get fired before then. And she was concerned that this party would get together and oust her because some of her rulings had come down against the party. And not just the individual candidates, but about the people who were part of that party. Then we have rights and responsibilities. Everybody's very quick to claim their rights, not so fast to admit their responsibilities that go with them in an equal basis. You've probably seen a lot of that, when people demand to have their rights fulfilled, but not so quick to say, and in return for getting those rights, I will carry out my civic responsibility to do whatever the case may be. And finally on here is weaponizing the rules. And this isn't even a term that I heard more than 10 years ago, but it's something that I hear almost weekly now. That somebody is using a legitimate set of rules, whether it's a code of conduct or an act, against other people. And a lot of times, with malicious intent. That there's no real and legitimate reason to be posting a code of conduct complaint, but I'm going to do it anyway, just to gum up the system. So when we take all of these together, we start to see why the incivility is becoming worse and worse and worse. So here's where we start to talk about what's going on, about reversing the trend. There are three main ways we think this can happen. First is policy solutions, and you as governors are all about policy. And to me, policy is just pre-made decisions. So it is a case of trying to keep the barn doors closed before the horses think about running out. A lot of times our policies, though, are reactive. Something bad's happened, we don't want it to happen again. But if we can find a policy from somewhere else who's learned that lesson, maybe we can institute it in our municipality as well. There's some good practices there. Somebody told me once, when it comes to things like policies and bylaws, that plagiarism saves time. And if you can find a good example from somewhere else and borrow it and adapt it to your own municipality, that's not a bad thing at all. So those policy solutions. The second is practical things. What can you actually physically do that is going to either lessen or prevent this incivility from happening in your community? And finally is communications. How do we communicate or engage with either these us-them groups, with the public as a whole, internal to council, between council and staff, the behavior that we expect? And fundamental to all of this is we want people to model the behavior that we expect in others. It's that idea of the golden rule, just a bit of longer phrase. We can't control the public, however. We can set bylaws, we can set policies internal to our local governments and wider as well, but we can't control what the public does. I had a county reeve say to me, as part of an interview for the book actually, and it's in the book, she was lamenting that she was getting attacked by members of the public. And she was getting attacked in a ways that she could not respond to. And she said to me, how come we always have to take the high road? And I sensed the frustration in her, that she was bound by the bylaws and the policies and the culture and the expectations of her municipality, whereas those people, the keyboard warriors, the people on Facebook, weren't, and were quite happy to go against what bylaws or policies said. Did I miss one? No, there. So if we think about how we reverse the trend, the three big pieces we talked about here are role clarity, legislative change, and sticking to the legislation. So in the first part about understanding the roles, that is when a new person comes into government, a new councillor gets elected, the only things they really need to have, they need to be over 18, they need to live in your community, they had to get some nominations, they had to run a successful campaign and get elected. That's it. They didn't have to have training in advance. They didn't have to be a decent person, any of those sorts of things. So how do you ensure that people who are interested in running for local government are actually interested for the right reasons? How many of the people who run for local government in this country actually know what local government does? A lot of people don't, right? I ran for office unsuccessfully once, which is why I'm doing this. That was like 20 years ago, so I'd probably still be doing this by now. So in those cases, when I was knocking on doors, and some of you probably found this as well, I was as likely to get questions about immigration as I was about noisy dogs and garbage pickup, or about healthcare as I was about unsightly premises. So the city of Prince George in northern BC actually a couple of years ago, they put out a really neat brochure that talked about what the different orders of government do, the things that they deliver. And since that time, I've seen a lot of other municipalities plagiarize it, saving time, using the understanding that different provinces and territories do government slightly differently. But I thought that was a really interesting way of saying to people, if you're interested in running for local government, this is actually what local government does. Because if we get somebody who is interested in running for local government because they don't like what the schools are doing, they come into office, they get elected, they go through the orientation process, and then they find out they have no impact on what the schools are doing. So now what happens? So now you end up with a person who is elected, who gets 6 months later, realizes that they can't do what they thought they were going to do. They may become antagonistic, they may become a rogue person, they may check out. Best thing you can hope for sometimes is a by-election. So we've started to get in front of that with things like candidate workshops and suggesting that put a session on for the tire kickers so that they can hear from members of the municipality, from maybe retiring elected officials, to say what the job's really like. Following that are council orientations. You likely all do them in one form or another, with an understanding that there's a big difference between onboarding and orientation. With the onboarding, it's where do we park? Here are the keys. This is how you get paid if you get paid. These are the benefits that you get, all those sort of things. Whereas orientation is, what is governance? Where do we act, right? Knowing that we're not the doers, we're the thinkers. And understanding then that the role of council, the role of councillor, the role of mayor or warden, and then the role of CAO are all very different from one another. And the recognition that the administration is supposed to be objective. And they will bring you objective advice, you put your political lens in front of it, and you make a decision based on what you know best. So that orientation. And then ongoing refreshers. We worked with the city of Stratford in Ontario a couple of years ago on a regular professional development, half an hour once every 6 weeks or 2 months, that just said, this is a topic we're going to pick up on, and we're going to explore through half an hour before a council meeting. Governance moments, which comes to focused professional development. Things like this, things like regional conferences or FCM, where elected officials attend, and encouraging staff then to attend professional conferences of their own, whether it's in assessment or whether it's like chief CAOs, like the CAMA conference that was a couple of 3 weeks ago. that ongoing professional development, to acknowledge that it's important to keep on learning. Then there's the legislative change. Nova Scotia, for example, with their recent change around codes of conduct and bylaws and policies and resolutions. A lot of provinces don't say very much at all about codes of conduct for municipal councils. Some do. Alberta, I don't know why they did this, a few weeks ago rescinded every code of conduct across the province. 300 and some codes of conduct overnight were just gone. There's nothing to replace them right now. So it's a bit of a vacuum. For codes of conduct, council CAO covenants. Any of you who have had the opportunity to work with George Cuff have probably heard him talk about this. He's a big proponent, and I think he's right on this. He's a big proponent of common understandings between councils and their administrators. This is what you will do, and in return, this is what I will do. And if we can get that in writing, then you and I can argue back and forth, or we can argue, or you can argue with a piece of paper that we all agreed to at the beginning of our terms. So it removes some of the emotion out of that potential for abuse. The last is, I'm not sure if this is light or flippant or whatever, but the three pieces that you need in order for this to work are to know the rules, to have the rules, to know the rules, and to use the rules. I would suspect that some of you have been in office long enough to have realized that some of the rules that you have, your statutory rules, may no longer apply, and you may not have reviewed them for a very long time. We did a bit of work once with a really small community, and it was just after COVID, or no, it was during COVID, because they wanted to have a Canada Day party. And rather than having it in the local arena or someplace, they wanted to have it outside. So they wanted to put on an outdoor concert people could come to and still stay safely distanced. But when they checked their bylaws, they had a specific bylaw that said, this town does not allow outdoor concerts. Nobody could figure out why, until they looked at the date. This bylaw had been on the books since 1969, and it never changed. Does anybody know why an outdoor concert bylaw would have been enacted in 1969? Woodstock. They didn't want a repeat of Woodstock in their town. So, no harm, no foul. They rescinded the bylaw, went ahead with their concert. But what it told me was, what else is in that policy manual or that bylaw binder that probably ought not to be there? I made this comment in the conference I was at a couple of days ago, and there was a city manager at the back who put up his hand and said, the clerk and I have recently gone through all our bylaws and policies, and we have suggested the removal of over 1,000 of them. He said, we had a policy or a resolution that supported capital punishment in there. Which he said, well, we have nothing to do with capital punishment, of course. And so it would have had no effect either. But some of you and some of your municipalities 20 or 30 years ago may have had policies around being a nuclear-free zone. You may still have those on the books. So this is one of those cases of know the rules, know the rules. If you don't know what's there, it doesn't matter because there's no rule. If you don't know what the rule, it's not there. So if you have the rules that are in place, you know the rules, and then you have to use them as well. So having a rule and not using it is the same as not having it at all, which is where we get to that idea about bylaws and policies being enacted before the horse starts to think it wants to run out of the barn, where we can learn from other municipalities, where we can learn from our colleagues like those who are here. So these are the sorts of things that I've seen in terms of how do we reverse the trend. So here's where I quote my esteemed colleague, Craig. Well, just flip by it. Craig is fond of saying there's only one way to eat an elephant, one bite. I should have got you to say this, Craig. One bite at a time. So this is Craig quoting Desmond Tutu. Because sometimes, Craig, we did this session for PMA, for professional municipal administrators in Newfoundland a few months ago, and Craig actually did a part of this on practical considerations. So his comment here is, sure, it's a big problem. Sure, it's going to take a long time to solve. Sure, it would have been better if we started a couple of years ago, but the second best time, as you all know, to start this is now. So what are some of the things that we can actually do about it? How do we de-escalate the issue? And in fact, on your table there are some little pamphlets on de-escalation, particularly around how do we handle this within a council meeting context. So how do we deal with this one bite at a time? And so some of those considerations I just talked about are some of the things that we might want to think about as we continue to go. So there are here are some tools for you, some tools that we could use within the municipal office. There'll be some tools we could use within a council meeting, and then some other things as well. So just with this, with this in mind then, you can use training. We talked about the professional development in that last slide, but the more you know, the easier it is for you to exercise good behavior and for your colleagues to exercise good behavior, and it removes that plausible deniability of we didn't know. If there's a budget for training or professional development, whether it's for individual courses or programs or conferences, it shows that your municipality is taking this seriously. Signage. Many of you will, in your council chambers, will have signs that say, we do not tolerate harassment, or in public buildings will say, we do not tolerate harassment of staff. So that then removes some of the emotion, because when somebody is doing something they ought not to be doing, we can say that the contravention is between that person and the sign that's on the wall that we all agreed to, not between that person and me because I brought it up. So signage is important, constant reminder. For the same reason, for those of you who have strategic plans here in the room, I really like having things like vision statements right on an agenda. Like, where are we going and why are we getting there? So signage, that visibility is important. The physical design of space. I made reference earlier to the plexiglass barriers that were there during COVID. But we've seen more open space design, more visible sight lines. Those are the sorts of things that can be used to protect individuals. Top-line modeling, or modeling the behavior we expect in others, we've already talked about. Something that I struggle with a little bit is, how do we reward civility? Certainly we can call out incivility, but what do we do to recognize those people who are modeling that behavior that we accept of others? So some sort of a civility-based program. And finally, well-being. I have a friend who wrote a book called The Economics of Well-being, and another one called The Economy of Happiness. And he talked about that in terms of well-being, as I tend to describe it as, what are you doing in your communities right now that makes it a place that your grandkids want to call home? Now, whether that's within your council structure, within your municipal structure, or within the impact that the municipality has on the broader community, all of those things contribute to the well-being of the community. So these are some of the things that you can do just within your office. If you're thinking within a meeting itself, some of the tools that you can use here are things like civility moments. I mentioned that already. This comes out of the idea of safety moments on a job site, where we all got together before a meeting. Somebody was assigned to present 30 seconds or 2 minutes on what do we consider to be good behavior or safety, and how do we promote that? Why can't you do something like that for a council as well, or in a community meeting? The next is the visibility of rules. It's the same concept for council as for administrators, about have the rules in place and make them visible. Engagement, public engagement, communications, that honest feedback going backwards and forwards between the municipality and the people who are within the community. That if people feel heard, maybe they're less likely to behave in a poor way. The civility pledge is something new as well. We all have an oath of office at the beginning of a term. Why can't we once a year say we will be nice to one another? Maybe in a few more words than that. But in that case, if we're saying that we will be respectful of one another and diverse opinions, then again, the argument comes to we are disagreeing with the disagreement is between us, or me, and the pledge that I signed, not between you and I. This also sets out the expectation for what good behavior is. And we're looking to be able to keep that good behavior happening. The pledge is also something that can be published, so that if members of council councillors behaving badly, we can actually see that on the internet. I don't know if any of you have ever read the book Mayor's Gone Bad. Oh, yeah. By Philip Slayton. He wrote it in 2015. It's a really interesting read about some of the mayors across Canada who perhaps have gone beyond the bounds of what they ought to have done. Some of them, well, I'll leave the names out. Go ahead. You know what? We keep this. If we keep this up, I'm going to send you a bill for therapy because this has now turned into catharsis.
Do you know Andy Wells?
No, but I do know Peter Kelly. Apropos of nothing, Mayor. And then there's the idea of the Civility Pledge and the Civility Campaign. How do we encourage people to behave properly? We model the behavior we expect in others, but at least we need to tell them what that behavior is. And thirdly is kind of how do we get support? This kind of a group is a great group for support, these peer groups that are here. So whether this is this group, whether it's local, whether it's provincial, any of these things will work. And then partnerships. It's nice to see people like Juanita here from the Municipal Association, because those are the kind of groups that can bring municipalities within the province together. The administrators associations and the municipal associations. Even groups like CAMA or FCM fall into that as well. So these are some of the tools that we can use. The final piece here is about communications, human first communications. And that is, so we've got all the rules in place, we've got the expectations there. What do we do in order to make sure that they get carried out properly? And actually, I'm going to just escape time, I'm just going to skip that one. This is just some examples of backlash. These are all big municipalities, of course. But people are quite happy to express their frustration anonymously and online. If you look at the people or the accounts here, they don't identify themselves. They just say what they're mad about. And there are a lot of people who are mad about a lot of things. So how do we actually deal with this sort of stuff when it comes in? This is just as an example of what would come in over social media. But you're probably getting cards. We use the term cards and letters, but I'm not sure if anybody's gotten a card recently. Or a letter, for that matter. Some people probably still do. So when you're thinking about the incivility that is coming at us as municipalities, whether it's administrators or whether it's elected officials, when do we decide if we want to do something about it or not? In this case, if we think about these 4 questions, does the comment that you received contain misinformation that needs correcting? Does the situation, is the situation escalating and requiring de-escalation? Is it personal attack or harassment? And will responding improve community understanding? You, whether it's you individually or you collectively, need to make a determination about whether those things are present or not. If they are present and you do need to react, then do it with a strategic response. Try not to respond to the individual comment. Try to respond to the theme that's behind it, or the desired outcome that's behind it, because that then can be used to respond to a variety of different comments of a similar theme. If you see these, though, and they don't quite meet that test, you say, you know what, we're just going to leave it alone. There are some municipalities who have said, we're sure we have accounts online, but we're not going to put any comments on those accounts. People can say what they want to say, we're not responding. And does anybody do that? Just say, we're not responding? Okay. Pardon? It depends, yeah. Sure. And that's where it doesn't meet that test necessarily. But strategic communications or a strategic reaction plan about how are we going to act based on the circumstance is the way that you can actually start to think about dealing with that. So in this case, I've got a quote up here from a woman named Cheryl Spencer Morley, who has helped us out on this as well. Saying talks about her background is strategic communications. She was actually in charge of communications last summer for the town of Jasper just recovering from their wildfire. So she was having to deal with a lot coming at her very quickly. And we work with her quite a lot as well. So she has said, if you want to create an expectation of civility, share some positive stories about your municipality. Now, you may do that already, but you may not. Some of us are kind of bashful when it comes to our local governments. When we do a lot of strategic planning, and one of the questions I ask as we look back on previous years is, how did you celebrate success? And very few people say that they do. They say, you know what, we're public sector organizations, we're used to getting stuff done and just moving on to the next thing, which is great, but it doesn't really give you a sense, that corporate sense of success. Because the governments of all sorts are quite used to getting beaten by a stick, not so used to getting the kudos as well. So we're used to how to deal with that. Model respectful conversations I've talked about quite a bit. Create online spaces for productive engagement. So this is where you might moderate, like literally moderate, some of your online accounts, whether they're Facebook groups or whether they're blog posts, even if they're letters to the editor. And then respond to concerns in ways that foster understanding, not division. So don't tell so-and-so that they're an idiot, even if they are an idiot. Don't tell that coffee shop senate that they're really off their rockers. Maybe try and engage with them. I've heard not uncommon stories of mayors or members of council who will actually go to A&W on Tuesday morning to meet with that group from time to time. Essentially to say, put up or shut up, I'm here, what do you want to talk about? So those are some of the things that you can, the ways that you can diffuse some of the things that aren't going well. So we wanted to leave quite a bit of time here for your insights and your questions as well. And then we'll move on to our next session. So I think Chris was going to come up and we were going to shift here. And I'm really happy to respond to any questions you have. I'd also really be interested in any insights that you have as well. Your own experience either with incivility or with overcoming that incivility. Because ultimately what we're looking for is to make things better in the long run. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris. And I'm happy to respond to any questions or comments that you got.
So Ian and I are going to sit down first, and I'm going to ask him a few questions pointedly, because he loves answering my questions with, it's always not what it seems to be about, so that's his favorite line. I always, there you go, it's never about what it's about. So I'm going to sit over here. We're going to go back and forth from, you can throw that there if you want, sit on down. We're going to go back and forth from questions from me and then questions from the audience, and don't be afraid to ask. So you're going to sit there, okay, so I have to walk. You have to walk. So, Ian, first off, I've got to ask a very simple question. Why are you the one that had to write the book about uncivil societies?
Well, by accident. I mentioned at the very beginning that this was one of the topics that found us. And because we have the opportunity to literally work from coast to coast to coast in this country, it's been really interesting to see some thematic similarities on things like incivility, abuse, harassment, all of those things, why it's getting worse and where it's getting worse. So having written a couple of books before, I don't actually remember that moment when I decided, you know what, I should put 50, 60, 70,000 words down on a piece of paper and do this. But I think the touch point may have been that Bucking the Trend Symposium, Chris, that you were at. And how do we actually make a difference from that? Getting some ideas, sensing the frustration, but trying to leave with a little bit of hope as well.
What hope do you have for society in today's world?
I'm a bit of a Pollyanna.
Of course you are.
And sometimes I'm not sure if that's a good idea or not in terms of how government operates. One of the reasons I really enjoy local government is because of all the orders of government we have, it's the most agile. People talk about how government takes forever to make change in government. And I guess I run a private company, so I can make a decision today and have it implemented tomorrow. But you can't, and I recognize that. But there are faster and slower ways of doing things, so local government is the most agile. My hope comes from a group of people or encouraging a group of people to run for office and to stand on their principles that say this behavior we're seeing is intolerable. We've got to do something about it. We recognize that the public isn't going to change until we do. Although, I mean, ultimately we do need the public to change, but we're going to have to model that behavior, show them that we can do things respectfully internally before they're going to follow up and do it as well.
What's step one, though? Because that's the hardest part of any journey is step one, because we all can't change what our public is going to, how they're going to react to any decision. And I've said on my show, and you and I've chatted numerous times, that any decision that you make as a councillor, as a mayor, a warden, 100% of the people are never going to be on board. There's always going to be those angry people. The mayor can go out and say that the sky is blue, and they'll say, no, it's turquoise or green or gray or foggy. How do we start that journey?
Well, let me start with the fog comment, and I want to say how beautiful the weather has been ever since I arrived in St. John.
Wow.
Happily. The political courage, I think, is really important. That those people who are elected, I have yet to run into an elected official who says, you know, I want to keep everything exactly the same 4 years from now as it is today. They all want to change in some fashion, and they always want to change something for the better. And every decision a council makes or an individual councillor makes is a political decision. And so there's courage associated with that. And the example I often use about that is in the 1970s and 80s, we spent a lot of money on capital money on building tennis courts. Tennis was pretty popular. It waned over the years. And as it waned, then the preference for or the desire for pickleball grew. And so we had a choice. What do? Do we build brand new pickleball courts? Do we convert tennis courts to pickleball? And municipalities kind of did both. But at the end, we ended up with fewer and fewer tennis courts. Now, making that change from tennis to pickleball was a political decision as well. So the creating things is a political decision, changing things is a political decision, and ultimately removing something is also a political decision because you're going to offend somebody. When it comes to how do we deal with civility and that political courage, I've said to many a council during an orientation, if you guys all agree with one another all the time, only one of you needs to be here. And I think that that's true in terms of the change that we're looking for, is that we're looking for a diversity of opinions on council that deal with each other respectfully, can challenge each other for sure, but certainly recognize at the end of the day that something is a council decision. And the courageous part comes from the knowledge that you as members of council have, and that those people who are opposed to what you're doing are often saying you guys are making the wrong decision, but they're making that assumption based on the information that they have. You have that information, but you also have more. And because you are privy to information that has been dealt with in private or in camera or in closed session, you may well turn a yes to a no because of that, and you can't explain it to the public necessarily. So that, to me, that's political courage. And some people, when they're, say, on their last term of office, when they're not seeking out re-election, have that ability to maybe have a little bit more courage than somebody who's thinking about serving their first year of maybe 2 or 3 terms. But I think setting up that behavior, that expectation that local government is a change agent and that change is not always comfortable, I think is a useful thing to do right off the bat. So I'd start with that political courage.
In your presentation, you talk about people telling councillors, mayors, wardens, reeves that you should have tough skin. Everyone here got elected in their own right because they wanted to give back to their community. Tough skin is part of the job in some sense, but when does the tough skin become rubber skin? Because you can't just let everything fall on you and take everything that people tell you to heart. What is the sort of requirement for a councillor or a mayor or a warden to ensure that what is being yelled at them, because people have the right to vent in the ways that they feel they have the right to vent in, civilly, not angrily, not abusively. Where does that border lie in that, going from being honest and open and just frustrated about what's going on at council to being that bully, as you said? Because you talk about tough skin, you talk about sort of that area where you and I can disagree on something, but it's still bullying.
Sure, it brings me back to grade 6, Chris.
You're welcome.
In my I don't know why I remember this, but in my social studies class, I remember reading a quote that said, "The right of your fist ends where the right of my nose begins." And I thought it was a really interesting insight. And to me, that's kind of what I'm talking about, the thick-skinnedness. That sure, you have to have a thick skin. You have to be prepared for the thrust and parry and disagreements and scrunched up faces as you're facing community groups or members of council. But you should not be subjected to something that crosses the line. Nobody signed up for the harassment, the incivility, and the abuse. They probably did sign up for some of those difficult conversations. So to me, it's perhaps a little bit simplistic. But if we have a code of conduct or even a code of public expectation, I think there are some people, I think there are some municipalities that have actually set codes of what we expect from the public as well. Once we have started to contravene those, to me, that's where the line gets crossed, and that's when we have to call out the behavior. And if we don't call out the behavior, it becomes acceptable. It's another one of those cases of knowing the rules, having the rules, knowing the rules, and using the rules. If we don't use them, they don't exist. It's like having a bylaw for unsightly premises, and if we never enforce that, or we don't have any bylaw officers in town, that bylaw doesn't really exist. So I think once it crosses the line from civil behavior to a contravention of bylaw, policy, or statute, that's when I think that we need to call it out.
You bring up code of conduct. You're right that Alberta just a few weeks ago removed code of conducts. And one of the rationales behind it was they're being weaponized. they're being weaponized against fellow councillors, and they're not being used for the reason that they were originally intended for. I know Nova Scotia just implemented and mandated that municipalities have to have code of conducts. How do councils ensure that they aren't being weaponized? Because that is another form of uncivil abuse between council members that seems to be rampant right now.
It is, but it's also, I think the removal in Alberta's case, because they said they were being weaponized, is an over response. That sure they are being weaponized, all good things will be used poorly at some point, but I think having the rules is still the most important thing. When intra-council conduct issues pop up and we're raising codes of conduct against our colleagues on council, I think that that's one of those places where we can call each other out a little bit. And there are several codes of conduct that actually include within them that if the use is inappropriate, that itself is a code of conduct violation. So we can call each other out that way. When it comes to members of the public being able to file code of conduct complaints, which doesn't always happen, that becomes more difficult. And you have to almost start gathering a body of information. And then sometimes the courts start to get involved too. About is this become a defamation or harassment or something like that. But if we can't trust our colleagues on council, it becomes very difficult to make a different expectation for people in the broader community.
When writing your book on civil society, did you find more feedback, or while you were interviewing subjects on this matter, did you find more people talking about the public council uncivil manners, or were you hearing more council manners?
More public, for sure.
Really?
Yeah, more public about public council as well as public administration. And administration could be anybody from the city manager to the Zamboni driver. That it's not just members of council who are suffering from the harassment. It's a lot of people and a lot of people are really powerless as well, because if they're on the receiving end as an administrator, there's not a whole lot they can do with members of the public either. So I've seen both.
Is there a way that council members and mayors and wardens can protect their administration? Because administration can feel like they're helpless. I was in administration, and I remember getting nasty emails when the mayor asked us to change our social media page from being just normal to Pride Month. And the amount of visceral hate that we got thrown back in our face. And as a gay man, just reading all the negative comments from people that I had gone to stores with, gone out to movies with, it can be damaging to an administrator's psyche. How can council protect administration, because they can't be everywhere all at once, and they only have technically one staff member, which is the CAO?
That's right. Well, first of all, council has to empower the CAO to protect staff. A lot of CAOs will do that anyway, without the express permission or requirement of a council, and I think that that's wise. And that is set up internally through internal policies or directives or whatever you call them. But the council has to stand up for their CAO with a no tolerance perspective on poor behavior that is being directed toward the CAO, with an expectation then that filters down as well. That if council gives permission to the CAO to respond, then the CAO gives permission to the rest of the staff to respond, backed up essentially by council with whatever rules that they can put in place. Because again, council's a policy group. They're not going to create a press gang and go out and get the person who's being abusive. But they can certainly clear the way for other officials to respond as necessary.
There was a comment yesterday during one of the sessions about the upper levels of government being a little bit open to the media when talking about municipalities in a more negative way. You talk about sort of the on the ground, what local government deals with. How do municipalities deal with upper levels of government? Because they are party politics, and you talked about the uncivil aspect of party politics. Is there a way that councils can ensure civility between themselves and their upper levels of government? And I say that, and I know if Scott Pierce from FCM was here right now, he'd be yelling at me saying they're not the upper level, they're the equal level of government, because the federal government, provincial government, and municipal, they're all the same level to the FCM.
And I would be on Scott's side.
There you go.
So I tend to call them orders of government rather than tiers or levels, just because I think they're equally as important, and with one missing, we have a huge gap. So I call them different orders of government rather than levels. There's too much politics in politics. Sometimes I think that we don't work with our MPs, our MPPs, members of the MHAs,
MLAs.
MLA, all those M's, nearly as well as we can. And we recognize that because municipalities are different in every province and they're all established and altered and dissolved by the individual provinces as well, that there is a power dynamic there, that there isn't, say, between the provinces and the feds. Also because the two other tiers of government work on the Westminster model and we don't, that has an impact too. So I think there's an advocacy role for individual municipalities with their local representatives, I think with provincial associations, or at least the boards of provincial associations, with the provincial caucuses or territorial caucuses, and then groups like the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, who ought to be doing some advocacy on behalf of municipalities as a whole. In every one of my books, I've put in my favorite saying of all time, and it is, we must all stand together, or most assuredly we will all, sorry, let me try this again. We must all hang together, or most assuredly we will all hang separately. And I think that applies for municipalities or any order of government, really. And the fact that we are so similar and that we fight amongst each other sometimes, particularly municipal neighbors, it flummoxes me a little bit. And I get why that happens sometimes, but I don't think it's helpful in the long run. So to me, I think advocacy is the only way to go about that, because we as local government can't set the rules for provincial or federal government.
Ian, so where can people get copies of your book, and how can people reach out to you? Because I'm assuming this conversation cannot stop here, and it needs to continue on. How can people reach out?
Well, a lot of you have actually talked about how important this conversation is, and we're coming in partway through it. That I know that this has been going on for the last few years. It's going to continue on for the next few years. So the idea is going to have to evolve as we continue to go, whether it's solutions or even kind of what the problem is. It's going to happen. If you are interested in a conversation, my contact information is on the slide here. I've often said we don't charge for phone calls, so if anybody wants to give us a call or me a call, you're welcome to. I've got there's a couple of business cards on each one of the tables. Feel free to take that. The book is available through Municipal World, through their bookshop. All of my books are available through Municipal World. There's a QR code on the slide if you're interested, and I've got like 3 or 4 or 5 copies here too, that if anybody wants them, willing to sell them to you. I'm not one giveaway per conference, and otherwise we're happy to provide those to you. So I really appreciate that the invitation to come here, to come to St. John for the first time, to have such lovely weather while we're here, and to get to speak to the Atlantic mayors. It's been a real privilege, so thank you so much for inviting me.
And thank you for all your questions, for everything you've helped lead this conversation, Ian. Greatly appreciated. I just want to remind you that books are over where Tyler's standing. I was going to say Craig, but that is not Craig. That is Craig. I'm really bad with names on the last day of conventions. And for anyone who's listening to this for the live recording, we just want to remind everyone the links to purchase Ian's book will be in the show notes below, so be sure to check that out. And thank you so much for having us, and I think we're turning it back over to Craig for a roundtable discussion, and we're done. Thank you so much.